Hello, members. Good morning. And by the way, we have a very interesting setup today, but they're not turning on their cameras. The whole team from EGBC is actually watching this workshop from the Sustainability Lounge.
Okay, cool.
Yes. Yeah. So we'll just wait a few more minutes until we start. Yeah. So how was the break for everyone? Good. Short?
No break.
Yes. This is what happens. I think, you're the CEO and founder. This is what happens when you own a company.
I don't get to take break. No break.
Yes.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Can you tell us about your the award or the, if that's okay to share?
What award?
I recall there was a good thing happening during the Congress.
We were part of the Moya pitch competition. So like for make it in the Emirates. So I had the first day, which was the day before EGBC's Congress, and then the second day was the last 6 companies, and I had to attend that. So that's why I was there for that. So that's why I wasn't able to come to the Congress.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry, but I hope I heard Nudge did a good job. I hope. Yeah.
She did, yes. Okay. And I felt happy because I think it was kind of good news that you actually had to miss our Congress for Zeroe, which meant that you had passed kind of the first competition part, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. So just give it 3 more minutes. We can kickstart at 11:05, inshallah. So we'll start shortly. Just waiting for more people to jump in. So I think we'll start. Assalamu alaikum and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining yet another very interesting technical workshop for members by members. Today's workshop will be delivered by Zeroe Software Solutions, specifically by Farouk Jivani, CEO and founder of the company, and Najd Al-Raisi, Climate Solutions Consultant. And it's going to be on Beyond Carbon, building a sustainability data system that lasts. So Najd and Farouk, go ahead.
Thank you for having us. Nice to meet you all. Nudge will take point, and then I'll be jumping in as we go through this. Thank you for taking your time on your Friday before your weekend to attend. I think this is an interactive discussion. So as we kind of go through this, please unmute yourself, turn on your video, don't turn on your video, and feel free to, ask questions, engage in conversation, take our conversation in a different direction if you would like. We're happy to kind of discuss as we go through this, because I think it's, the goal is to be kind of like a joint learning and education exercise. I'll let Nudge kick it off. Yeah.
All right.
Nudge, maybe you want to give a bit of an introduction about your background and how you joined Zeroe and what you do here.
Cool. Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here, and thank you, Lana and the team, for this opportunity. I think we're building on our presentation from the last engagement or the Congress. So in terms of my background, so in university, I actually did sciences, and I'm always super interested in the environmental sciences and kind of the energy transition. And then I started working at OQ, which is the National Omani Energy Company, and I specifically worked under alternative energy in OQ. And so a lot of my time was actually dedicated towards carbon management and sustainability. And then that slowly over time evolved into kind of focusing on building a system for carbon management. And so I spent over 2 years at OQ kind of developing our own tool and system for sustainability management. And I got a bit frustrated with that whole process. I got frustrated with the sustainability process, with how companies approach carbon management, almost like an afterthought instead of having it embedded within their company strategy. And so after 3 years at OQ, I joined Zeroe to kind of move from the client end and from the customer end to actually building tools that actually help organizations with their sustainability journey. And so that's a bit of my background. I feel very strongly about building sustainability and carbon management systems. And so today's topic is going to be all about that and how we can move beyond carbon and into building sustainability data systems that last, not just focusing on data itself or the reporting process. Next, Farouk. Just in terms of the agenda today, we'll start by discussing the data challenges that we all know and that I spoke about in my previous presentation as well, and why a lot of ESG teams across organizations and across countries as well face similar problems. We'll then talk about this infrastructure and moving into building sustainability systems rather than just dealing with data and reporting as it comes. Then I'll introduce the three-layer model, which is a tool that helps set up the right infrastructure and that helps guide us in the right direction when starting this journey. And then finally, we'll end by emphasizing why it's important or why it's okay to start small and make meaningful changes incrementally as we go. Next. So just kind of talking about the problems that a lot of sustainability teams spend the majority of their times on. And it's this endless loop of data handling. It starts with requesting data, going back and forth with different stakeholders on actually obtaining that data, and then cleaning up whatever format we receive and reconciling kind of the data that we receive now versus historical data, and then finally creating reports. And so this takes up the majority or over 50% of the time of sustainability teams within organizations. And so a lot of these struggles and problems are not because of the lack of commitment or lack of awareness of sustainability teams or organizations. It's rather the lack of a system that enables us to make meaningful change and put together meaningful strategies when it comes to sustainability. Next. And so what this leads to is obviously time lost. So a lot of time and hours diverted from planning into data management and data handling. It causes communication delays because often reporting deadlines are pushed back, because once we get to that point where we need to actually publish the report is when we catch a lot of the problems with the data. And so this causes communication delays. It also makes for the difficulty to adapt to new frameworks. Obviously, sustainability landscape is evolving. We get new commitments, new policies all the time. And so if we don't build the proper systems, that means that we have to dedicate more time as these regulatory frameworks come in order to adapt to them. And then finally, it leads to cross-function friction because there are no clear roles and responsibilities between different departments. Nobody wants to be the owner of the problem or the owner of emissions data or the owner of, things that are going wrong. And so that causes a lot of friction. And these challenges, they don't just waste our time, they compromise the company's overall momentum and strategic direction. Next. Now, I would say that things are the way that they are because we often ask the wrong questions when we handle sustainability data. So we ask, where is the data? Or who has the files? Or when is the deadline? Whereas we should be asking, how does this data flow into our systems or between our systems within a company? And how do these systems connect? And where can we automate? Next. Now, I'll give you an example of energy here because energy data is everywhere, but it is surprisingly hard to work with. And so I'll walk you through kind of the common problems and the challenges and how this can improve. So starting with a very common problem that we have, which is we receive energy data through metering, through bills or invoices. So this, even if it's like a digital format, it usually does not capture the emissions data that we need. And so this results in time wasted on data collection and kind of handling and turning that data into a form that we can actually use for analysis. And this can be bypassed by just setting up the proper digital capture systems, where you don't have to then send your invoices or you don't have to send these bills to someone else for the analysis. You just directly submit it into a system that treats it for you. Another common problem is legacy metering, where you have an organization have one common meter that serves multiple entities. And so it's very hard to compare where the actual emissions activity is happening. And causes like the inconsistent structure causes a lot of delays in kind of reconciling where the emissions are supposed to be allocated. Another common problem when it comes to energy is manual data entry, so human error, obviously. And this limits our ability to track progress because we're spending a lot of time kind of firefighting the data itself instead of analysis. And finally, no standardized tracking system causes delays again for decision making and could be bypassed by setting up proper accessible reporting interface. So this just shows how common formats and flows create unnecessary friction. This can all be bypassed if we kind of set the system up correctly to begin with. Next.
And just to maybe we pause for a second. I think maybe we can ask the people that are attending, are these problems that maybe if you're kind of in a role in your organization where you are handling data related to sustainability, did the problems that kind of Nudge kind of has gone through, like, do those resonate with you? Does this make sense? Or
You
maybe
you can drop it in the chat also if you don't
you can
want.
also drop in the chat. We'll continue on that. Okay.
I can tell you just on behalf of our members, I mean, from what we hear, that yes, I mean, legacy metering, we hear about that. Data entry, that is manual. Yes, no standardized tracking system. So these things that pop up here and there, just to confirm.
Another big example for this would be refrigerants and fugitive emissions, because a lot of organizations don't even capture this data. And if they do, it lies with maintenance that's usually carried out by third parties. So that requires you to now engage with people beyond your organization. And even when you do, usually when it comes to fugitive emissions, specifically refrigerants, we don't really capture the amount of refrigerants. That's very unorthodox. What we usually do is we usually capture how much we spend in order to top up on refrigerants or buy refrigerants. And so there is a very significant gap to begin with when it comes to refrigerants. So we don't report the actual gases that are being emitted. We just report how much we basically spend in order to purchase them. So a lot of issues here, including formatting issues, which I talked about, access issues. So data sits with outsourced maintenance providers. And usually, even when you ask for this data, you don't receive full data. There are usually significant gaps and breakdowns because, again, nobody is keeping track. Ownership breakdown, so the responsibility is split between the building owners and kind of the facility teams or even these third-party providers. And then finally, in terms of timing, maintenance logs are irregular and retrospective, no real-time reporting or prevention triggers. And this means that this is not a reporting problem, it's a system design challenge that needs to be addressed. So should we stop here and ask if you guys share this frustration when it comes to refrigerants, fugitive? Okay. We can move on, Farouk. All right, what does this mean for reporting? This means that we have to deal with an endless data collection period that lasts all year, basically, multiple follow-ups going back and forth. And this means that we're handling data or we're processing data manually with inconsistent formats. And this gives us very, very limited time for analysis. Like I told you, usually this is done once we're actually ready to publish the report is when we catch a lot of the gaps and issues with the data itself. So this makes reporting on GHG or ESG a reactive manual exercise. And the insights come very late and often too late to actually drive change. Because by the time the sustainability report is published for last year's data, and when we have some time to do analysis on it, we're already actually having to start planning for the next reporting cycle and going through this whole process again. Next. Another issue is the lack of transferability between the different reporting standards. Now, I've listed the major reporting standards here, like GRI, GHG protocol, CDP. And although these different kind of frameworks and standards work around very similar data and data concepts, they are actually very different in terms of the data formatting, the frequency, and the structure that they require. So for example, if I take the biggest two standards that almost everybody has to work with, which is GRI and GHG protocol, we see that GHG protocol focuses a lot on carbon and carbon management, GHG, obviously. So it works with activity data. It goes to the source and it requires you to kind of submit where the emissions data is occurring. Now, this is a continuous process. You have to kind of keep track of this either monthly or quarterly. And a lot of the time, every time it involves calculations and analysis. So you take that activity data and then you have to kind of perform some sort of analysis on it, and that dictates how you report on your emissions. Versus GRI, which is ESG centered, it involves calculations, but it also involves data that does not require any calculation or any analysis from your end prior to reporting. So this is already very different, and the data points captured are very different. And usually we release a sustainability report once a year, and usually those reports are very policy oriented. Now, although, like I said, these reporting frameworks kind of work around similar data, they don't really, or you cannot really transfer your data that you've captured for one of them and use it to build up your report for the other one, because we don't have the proper systems that enable us to do this. So what ends up happening is the team kind of already does the GHG protocol or GHG protocol related work. And then if they have to report GRI, they have to repeat that whole process all over again just for GRI, instead of having a system that enables you to kind of transfer and use similar information across these different standards. And obviously, this policy is always shifting. We always have new disclosures that we have to report on. And so if we don't have an agile system, if we don't have a system that enables us to replicate and use the data and analysis that we've already done for another one, this means that we're stuck in an endless loop. And this becomes harder as more standards and more policies come. Farouk, do you want to add anything here?
No, I don't think so. Not at this time. No.
Cool. I'll pause here if anybody wants to have a discussion about.
Yeah, or any questions?
Yeah.
No? Okay, we'll continue.
Right. Okay. So now I want to talk about why we want to shift from kind of data work into setting up data systems and move beyond reactive and rethink how data flows between different departments and between different existing systems within an organization. So what does a resilient data system looks like? It's aligned with how the data is generated, so it goes right to the source of the data. It's flexible enough for multiple uses, especially given what I told you about the different standards and different policies. And it's stable even if staff changes or format changes. Now, I know this seems like not that big of a deal, but from my previous experience, you'd be surprised at how much delays are caused because just someone decided to take leave for like a week. All right, next, Farouk. So let's talk a bit about the three-layer model. The three-layer model really helps you kind of analyze and diagnose why certain emissions or certain activity data is very hard to use. And it helps you think about where to focus your improvement efforts because it lets you see where the breakdown happens. Is the issue with the source of your data? Is the issue with the structure of your data? Or is it an access issue? And so the source of the data is obviously where the data is created. Now, this can be in your ERP systems. This can be the invoices that you receive for energy, for example. This can be your smart meters. It's the source. Where is the data originating? Now, the structure of the data is the formatting of the data that you require in order to do your ESG analysis, i.e. what units need to be added, how do we categorize it, what format do we need to have this data in. Now, finally, access is then how you receive this data from these various departments. So how does the sustainability team or the team that's doing the sustainability or ESG related work receiving this data? Is it through integration with systems? Like, are you just pulling data from SAP or ERP? Or are you receiving them through emails? Are you receiving just scattered Excel files? Or what format are you receiving the data in? Next, I'll give you an example. Yes, so as an example, we chose like a hotel energy data. So usually the source of this would be a utility bill that's held by the building manager. Then the structure of this data is just a scanned PDF. It does not have any additional information, tagging, it does not break it down to a meter level. And then in terms of access or how it's sent to sustainability teams for reporting, usually sent by email and then usually sent in different formats, however they're received by the building manager. And then because there is no proper system put in place, this is also intermittent, like you're not going to get consistent data as sustainability team. So here we see that obviously the breakdown happens at the access level. And so a high volume data set becomes unreliable because we don't have the proper digital infrastructure for it. And through the three-layer model, you see exactly where you need to change or exactly what you need to focus your efforts in improving. Next. All right, scope 3. Now, I think there's another.
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry.
Perfect. So, so obviously we talked a lot about the issues surrounding data handling. Now this becomes significantly more complicated when we talk about scope 3, because then you're not talking about internal teams or stakeholders anymore. You're talking about going beyond your organization, engaging with suppliers and clients. And this data often sits with multiple teams, multiple suppliers. And so it creates a complex network that you kind of have to navigate. And if it's hard to get people within your organization to give you data, you can only imagine how much harder it is to engage your suppliers to get you data on time. This obviously causes format variations between obviously different organizations. You have to do a lot of manual work in order to clean up the data and get it into a format that you can use for scope 3. And you have very, very limited control over the data flow or external systems. Next. Now, just an example, and I chose business travel specifically because business travel, even though it is scope 3, a lot of the time this data still sits within an organization. So you don't really have to engage a lot of third parties unless your bookings are done by a third party. But let's take an example of a company that does this all in-house. So the source of the information that you require for business travel usually comes from HR, who does the booking for you. But then you also need to involve finance teams who actually pay for the trip. And so the data originates in separate departments across the organization with different priorities. And so good luck trying to get them to align on your sustainability deadline. In terms of structure, usually if we receive it through finance, then it does not involve any data or classification required for ESG or GHG people to do their work. It's strictly financial. And then in terms of access, like I told you, because it involves multiple departments, it's very uncoordinated and depends on people's schedules. And so it leads to a very labor-intensive process of having to chase people for the data, and then having to chase people for accurate data, and having to chase people and have them add the metrics that you require in order to do your analysis. So even though travel is a super common activity and the data should theoretically live within your organization, because it lives in silos across different departments, it makes doing your emissions or your ESG analysis so much harder.
And I think if we take like a practical example, right? You had experience with this like earlier this year, where we're working with someone and procurement has the amount spent on business travel, but it's not broken down by what the activities were, right?
Yes.
But then some of that information was with procurement, but then business travel done by employees that's reimbursed was being reimbursed by company expenses or expenses in HR and payroll, as well as petty cash, which was completely off the board, right? And once you got the procurement expenses, then you got a picture of what hotels they were booking, and what flights they were booking, but then also some hotels and flights were booked through expenses. So just within like one organization, you had like at least 4 different departments spending money on something, incurring emissions on something, and it was sitting across all 4 different departments. And it all ties back to like, how do you get that picture of where the data is, despite business travel being perhaps one of the easier scope 3 subcategories that you should be collecting and reporting on. Yeah.
Exactly. And then I just want to add here on business travel, just from experience, when we actually finalize emissions inventories, business travel compared to other source of activity data is such an insignificant category itself. Usually the emissions are so much smaller compared to everything else, compared to like purchased goods and services, for example. But you see how much work is required in order to get that one small category that should, in theory, we should have all the data. We should be equipped to kind of produce it in a very straightforward manner.
And when it's funny is when many organizations start saying, oh, well, let's do our scope 3, and then they think that the easiest will be employee commute and business travel, because an employee commute is relatively straightforward, right? But like business travel, you're like, they think it's the easiest, but they actually but then what they don't realize is like it's just multiple people, and the minute you have multiple people with multiple sources of information, everything slows down, right? Which is why this is all about data and not the actual report.
Exactly. And this is an example that shows you really, because of the lack of a system or unified system for dedicated to ESG or dedicated to GHG, you have all of these issues showing up. Next. Actually, Farouk, how about you talk about PGAS?
Okay. So in terms of kind of purchase goods and services, well, this is where, let's go and say this is like if you take a company's OpEx and CapEx, okay? So everything that you spend within an organization in the year, for me, that can kind of, apart from like the fuel that you're purchasing and stuff like that, everything else is going to end up sitting within scope 3, right? And then we look at scope 3 as like taking all of an organization's OpEx and CapEx and starting to peel the onion. Because at the end of the day, every dollar or dirham spent is going to then tie to something across these different categories of scope 3. Obviously, you need more data than the financial value, but it's all going to kind of boil down. The financial value gives you an indicator that there will be emissions somewhere, right? And you can take your CapEx, you move that aside. So that's your scope 3 category 2. And then you peel away in the rest of the spend, your upstream transportation and distribution, your spend on business travel, your spend on other activities, and you're kind of left with purchase goods and services, or PGAS, as like a GHG accountant would call it. And let's say you're spending $10 million a year, you have tons of different suppliers, right? Now, as every organization kind of goes through this, where do you start? So a lot of companies come and say, well, the number one step that we're going to do is we're going to start sending surveys to all of our suppliers. Yeah. So, well, you have 1,000 suppliers. And I think as any organization, if you're part of an organization here and you have to do a vendor registration for someone, you're going to start seeing this come out in your vendor registration processes. Tell us what your GHG emissions are. And what, but you end up, basically companies are ending up having to like send out surveys to 1,000 companies. Should they be sending out surveys to 1,000 companies? Probably not. Probably there's a portion of those companies that are the ones that are actually kind of important to deal with, right? But how do they actually figure that out? And if you look at kind of the different layers here, right? Like the source is your procurement systems, your supplier invoices. You may have only the amount that you spent with every vendor, but then how clean is this organization's, let's say, master data, right? So if you look at a company, you need to start looking at, all right, every PO line item in my Oracle or in my SAP or whatever ERP system I use, how clear is that PO line item? Because when a person, depending on the maturity or the evolution of any purchasing department or procurement or supply chain function in an organization, they're capturing information in a different way, right? So let's say I'm buying, steel bars, okay? How do I write steel bars in my procurement system? And how does a GHG accountant recognize what type of steel bar it was, what the origin of that steel bar was? Maybe you wrote in the unit of measure in a purchasing system 10, but 10 what? Maybe it was 10 20 kilo pallets, right? Maybe it was, and that's where kind of the quality of the data within an organization is super, super key. And it's a big challenge for many companies. Is right now, procurement systems are used to track the dollar or dirham value. And the systems and the data within a company, it's all structured around as long as we're accountable for the value of what we bought, that's enough for us. But when you want to move beyond, shall we say, the level 1 of maturity in purchase goods and services emissions calculations, you want to move from spend-based to activity-based, quantity-based. You need to understand how much of it you're buying. Then you need to understand specifically what are the emissions of that supplier related to these products, right? And you don't need to know it for everybody that you buy anything from, right? If we go buy a notebook from, a small thrift shop because someone needed a notebook in the company, should you really be spending time trying to figure out the emissions of that specific notebook, or should you be focusing on kind of large suppliers? Now, for us, when we look at this challenge, we think this is a data problem. And how is an organization approaching this problem to process this data at scale regularly? Yeah. And what we find is a lot of organizations struggle to do that, right? It's like, I'm just doing this for my GHG reporting or for my sustainability report. So one time a year, I'm going to look at this data and actually try to calculate emissions off of it. But what really needs to happen in most organizations is you need to actually go back and change the way
Capture.
procurement functions and captures data and how your material or service master is organized within an organization so that this doesn't become a burdensome, repeating, manpower consuming exercise every year. Because once you do it once and you decide to report on it once, the only thing that you're expected to do is do it again and improve its maturity. And I think that is where, recognizing that if as an organization is approaching, producing a sustainability report or reporting against a particular framework, this isn't a sustainability report exercise. This is a data exercise and it's a data journey.
Exactly. And one more thing, actually, I'll add to PGAS here is thinking about the system overall. And obviously, PGAS is a very intimidating category because let's say we have over 1,000 suppliers. When thinking about setting up an kind of data architecture within your organization that helps you along this ESG journey, you do not really have to start big. You can start by tackling one issue in terms of like your data structure, which is you can ask your procurement record going forward whenever you capture, for example, data, please add in the unit, please add in like this one thing that will then help you as a sustainability or GHG team to process that data so much more seamlessly. And so my argument here is that even for intimidating categories and even for scope 3, you do not have to start by overhauling everything. You can start by making small changes to the way you approach this data and then build on that incrementally. So
And
that
if I,
every
yeah, and I'll add, I thought of a practical kind of example that we experienced with an organization that we worked with. So, this organization measures scope 1 to 3, now on their third year, of measuring all subcategories and across 10 operating companies. But one of their businesses is an FM business. And within this FM business, they maintain all of the, kind of the assets of all of their other companies within the business and so on. And obviously in their procurement data, because it was an FM business, was the refrigerants and the freon that they were buying, which was effectively fugitive emissions, right? So they needed that data for fugitive emissions, but it sat within their procurement data. So they understood how much refrigerant and freon they're buying. And we pulled their procurement data, we isolated out with them what was the fugitive emissions data, and we calculated the emissions based on the quantities of the line items purchased. And their fugitive emissions were like crazy high. Yeah, it's like 30% of their overall footprint. And obviously that's wrong. There's something wrong there. So we start looking at the data with them. And when we look at the data, they're like, no, this is not right. Like, we need to go. So the sustainability team goes back to procurement, says, guys, like, you're not buying this much refrigerant. Like, why is this showing up? And the problem that they had was they didn't have an item code for the item that they were buying. So let's go and say something was sold in 8 kilogram containers and 32 kilogram containers. Well, they didn't have an item code for the 8 kilogram container. So they were just using the item code for the 32 kilogram container. So when you go and take the information and say, well, you bought, 132 kilogram containers, that wasn't the case. They actually just brought 100 8 kilogram containers as an example, right? But because the team that was ordering the items and the procurement team weren't being measured on the fact that, because they were just changing the PO value, they weren't changing the item code, and the item code is the one that had the item description is the one that had 8 kilogram versus 32 kilogram. So when it was about dollars and dirhams, it didn't make a difference because they would just change the price. But the minute you start using the description to understand what was being purchased, that problem is a master data problem in a company. Yeah. It's a problem of making sure that you clean that data. And just, that for them, what have they done in the 3 years that they've been doing this is they probably cleaned up probably 200 items in their 2000, item master. But that only gets cleaned up when the numbers get looked at, someone sees the problem and takes an action, right? And a lot of organizations say, well, our data is dirty, so we can't do anything. The way you clean the data is by doing something with the data. Otherwise, it never gets clean. And that's kind of a challenge with a lot of organizations.
I think we have one last example from scope 3, which is waste. And again, this is another example of what we track not equaling to what we need. And this should be a straightforward category where the source of your data sits with facility teams through facility logs, or even vendor reports if it's carried out by a third party. But the problem is that the structure of the data that you're capturing is usually just volume per bin or volume per reporting period. You don't further break it down to what's actually within those waste bins and how you're disposing of them. And this is super critical for your purposes as an ESG practitioner or a GHG practitioner, which does not get captured in the organization. And so you're limited and you're blocked because of a very specific data issue that's not being captured. And then you have to basically repeat that exercise, and you have to chase people every year or every time you have to produce your report. So I don't know if you guys have any questions about the 3-layer model or the examples we shared with you. I think it's a good idea to kind of pause here and hear from you. I actually had a question I wanted to ask before we started talking about the examples, which is, if you had to improve just one scope 3 data source this year, which one do you think it would be, and how would it help overall reporting?
Members, you all have access to your mics and cameras, so I encourage you to take part.
Or even tell us like the category you hate the most.
I'm not going to call out my names. Although I see some I know. I mean, I know all of you, alhamdulillah.
It's okay. We can move forward.
Okay.
I think we're coming to towards the end of the workshop anyway. I wanted to talk about accountability. We've talked a lot about setting systems and how not having the proper systems in place kind of causes a breakdown in accountability. But I wanted to re-emphasize this point and say that most systems today don't show who changed what or when, and that causes a lot of breakdowns in terms of planning ahead, because we don't really know which teams we should approach first. So no audit trails means no confidence in your data or data-driven decisions. And most teams, especially sustainability teams or even management, cannot trace updates or identify who's done the work or what the data owners have shared. And instead, when building or when rethinking about data management and setting up infrastructure and data systems, we should definitely embed traceability, and we should definitely have very clear roles and responsibilities and version control, because accountability is what transforms data from reporting to real insight. Farouk, I don't know if you want to add anything here?
No.
I had another question here that I'll pause, maybe someone actually wants to answer, which is, if you could fix one data issue permanently, which one would it be? Anyone? Lana, start calling them
Hi. Hi, Najd.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Manal. I'm from Atkins. I think for us, it's all of it. It's kind of just having a more streamlined process of collecting the data and making sure that the data is per the quality. So it's not, one particular set of data, although, some are harder to get than others, but really the entire process, just finding ways to make it more efficient, more streamlined is usually a big challenge, to be honest. And then if, in organizations, you have people, leaving, teams changing. So when we get like a new department or a new head of department, it means that you have to bring them to speed on the process and why we need this information, how they should provide it. So because we don't have a digitalized system, it becomes a really challenging exercise to do every year. And then when you get somebody new, so it's really overall just the entire process becomes challenging if we don't have it digitalized or streamlined.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. When we see this, like when we're working with organizations, because what we do is we go to organizations, help them digitize it, is the first thing we have to do is explain to every single, it's like the sustainability team or the ESG team knows what they're
They're the
trying to
easy,
achieve,
yeah. I mean, they know what
right?
they're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
It's just getting all
But
the other teams and
but
departments.
exactly, and a big part of actually implementing any system is ensuring that the organization can engage all the stakeholders and those stakeholders understand what it is, right?
Exactly.
And I think one of the challenges, so we see this kind of like progression, right? We see organizations that never measure and then organizations that start measuring. And when they start measuring, they'll do like 1 or 2 years manually, okay? And at some point, the understanding of how difficult it is and how tedious it was results in a decision to digitalize, right? Because it has to be, because and I think but I think what gets lost in this entire process is like, if you think about collecting all of this information manually, is like the damage it does to an organization's productivity.
Of course,
Because
you lose the will to live at some point.
Yeah,
That's why you go for digitalization.
Because all this information already exists somewhere. The point is it either wasn't collected in the format you wanted it to be collected when it was created, or when it was created somewhere, it is inaccessible to you.
Yeah.
Right? So really, when you're asking someone for kind of fuel logs, really what you're asking someone to do is go get it from the source that you can't get it from. Yeah. And it's that person's just doing I don't say like a non-value adding exercise in a way, right? Because they're just like a middleman between a sustainability team and the data that they need to get to. I see Deepika sent a message of, for me, it would be subcontracts and a combination of products and services. So subcontracts are like this catch-all, especially if it's in construction. It's a catch-all, right? It's like, oh, we had a 20 million dirham subcontract or a 10 million dirham subcontract. Well, what was in that subcontract is what kind of matters, right? Or how that subcontractor operates and how they, and that kind of then goes to, well, when I procured that subcontractor or I engaged that subcontractor as an organization as part of my RFP and as part of the contract, do I require reporting on the information that is key to me as a kind of contractor to report on? And I think majority of, shall we say, subcontracts are not structured in that way. So this is like, there's one asking a subcontractor to give a bunch of information, but if they're not contractually obliged to measure that information and provide it to you, then it becomes even a bigger pain to get if they're willing to cooperate. What's interesting is we engage with some subcontractors that are now experiencing that, oh, well, we cannot actually, win this contract or even bid for a contract unless we're able to commit to providing data to our contractor. And then in construction, as a kind of, I used to do a lot of work as a consultant in my past career as an implementation consultant. And if you kind of take every construction project, every construction, despite a construction firm being an organization, every project is its own little fiefdom, I kind of look at that, right? Like every site manager or project manager or construction manager is its own king of its own P&L, right? And its own delivery of a timeline. And getting each of these little fiefdoms to share, even for their own construction firm, to get information from their own projects has traditionally been and historically been a challenge, right? Because the person who has been appointed to deliver a project has been said, you deliver this project on budget for me with these resources, and you make me this margin. And if you do that, I don't care how you get it done, you get it done. And now when a sustainability team comes in and says, now you need to give me a whole bunch of other data, I says, like, this isn't even one of my KPIs. This is not going to make a difference to the profitability of this project, and it is all a distraction. Yeah. And then you have to deal with the cultural nuances of breaking that. Yeah. I think it's hard. It's not interesting. It's not easy. I don't know if that resonates, Deepika, but that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepika. Thank you, Manan. All right. In terms of what happens without system alignment, I think we've talked about this all along. Repetitive work, declining efficiency, eroding trust, and kind of diverting time away from important strategic planning. Next, Farouk. Okay, so let's talk about what good looks like instead. So in order, a good system or a good ESG/GHG system or architecture has modular design where you can add any new metrics without disrupting kind of your overall reporting flow. It is transparent, so it shows you exactly where the where the data is coming from. And I think there's something wrong with the slides. Yeah, it's transparent, so it creates for clear accountability lines, shared ownership, where it promotes cross-functional collaboration rather than kind of fighting over who owns the data and who's responsible for it. It's durable, so it's resilient to any staff or system turnover. And we already discussed how that can be frustrating, where you have to like onboard new people, kind of convince new people why ESG matters, why GHG matters, and that takes so much time away from the resources. And then finally, it's interoperable, so it works across different standards easily. You don't have to treat every standard or every framework disclosure as its own project. You can actually set up the system that allows you to transfer that data for different analysis purposes.
And I think I just on this like interoperable note, right? On this interoperable note, and I'm just thinking of Deepika's question and just thinking of construction as an example, right? So if you go and take like it's not just interoperable against standards, it's interoperable against like the purposes of what an organization would need this data for, right? So if you're collecting data for project budget reporting, right? And you then have to duplicate that effort because 2 weeks later in a separate business process, you now have to go and collect and report that data for sustainability purposes. You've just created two interoperable, well, they're not interoperable. There should be two, interoperable data streams, and you've created two separate ones. Yeah. If you have the business development team who then goes and chases another part of the business and says, well, we're trying to bid on these contracts, and in order for us to win these contracts, we need you to provide us this data. So you now have created a third one, right? And that becomes like this whole, it's all redundant activity, all based on the same source of information, just the detail that you need for, ESG or sustainability or specifically GHG reporting getting lost in business processes. Yeah.
That's such a good point, Farouk, because I remember from my OQ days, for example, it comes down to even like different events, or if the company wants to do presentations, or if it wants to engage with people, every one of those, every single presentation has to become its own project, because there is no system that anybody can refer to and just go pull exactly the data that they want. And so it then becomes kind of my responsibility as the sustainability person to help everybody. Every new project for them becomes a new project for me. And I think Deepika messaged.
She mentioned that it's true. Yeah, you got project-based and group-wide. It's like a duplication. Yeah. No, because you think about it, it would be, right? Because it's like, and there's probably so much duplication in this. Yeah. It's all about data. That's it.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I look at. Like the reports are all about data. And I think that's where a lot of like that's a big challenge. That's the thing that we kind of see, right? Is like sustainability is, oh, we produce this report and we meet this standard. And you're like, okay, but like it's not about the report, it's about the data. Because even if you get that report and you meet that standard and you produce that report, if that information is not actionable, it's useless to the organization. And that's what happens a lot in terms of like GHG reporting, right? Is, I'll go to companies' sustainability reports and I'll look at the sustainability report and I'm like, I can see how it has been created, how it's been collated. And then I'll understand kind of how they got to it. But then you'll go and say, well, okay, what's behind the scope 1 or what's behind the scope 2? What level of detail can you go down to? And it's like, well, we've got like stationary, mobile, fugitive. Great. Okay. Can you tell me stationary, mobile, and fugitive by project? Yeah. Okay. Can you tell me what assets resulted in what were part of creating that mobile? Maybe. Probably not. Because that probably got lost because the sustainability team didn't collect that information because they just needed that number because they needed to get the report out. Right? And then you're like, but how do you build a decarbonization plan unless you know the assets that consume that? Now, maybe you get the assets. So you know that it was trucks and cranes and forklifts and whatever else it may be. Okay, great. Can you tell me what specific model of crane, what specific model of trucks and forklifts it was, and what asset number that was within your asset registry? Because if you want to build a decarbonization plan and a company needs to start making decisions to decarbonize its business, it's going to want to do that as it has fully depreciated certain assets and decides to replace those assets. So if you want to be able to give, a CFO a decision to make, it can't be, we need to reduce our mobile combustion by 20%. Great. How are you going to do that? Where are you going to, where am I going to invest the money to do that? And it's all about the granularity of data to make that happen. I know we're running out of time.
Yes, I think we're at the end.
Last line.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of, we've already talked about the importance of setting up systems and infrastructure that helps us in terms of like strategic planning when it comes to sustainability. But I want to end on emphasizing that you can start with one aspect of that 3-layer model that I showed you. You can start by one emission source or making one small change, like Farouk mentioned earlier, like add a certain unit or add a certain kind of code associated with different line items that will help you, and then gradually you can improve and build on that. You can develop this over time. It can be a gradual effort instead of having to rehaul and bring in third parties to do the work for you like every reporting period, basically. I think that's all from our end. I don't know, Farouk, if you want to add anything else.
No, I think I like the end of our discussion. We got some questions and the conversation.
Thank you so much about data. I mean, we try to deal with it every day for the purpose of sharing insights into trends, benchmarking energy, benchmarking water, or trying to benchmark embodied carbon and so on. But thank you so much. It has been very insightful. And if any of the attendees would like to get in touch with Farouk or Najd, please let us know. We'll connect you. And this was recorded. It'll be posted on our website, and we'll also be sharing the presentation. So with that being said, I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye.